Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 5 greatest independent record labels. Now, the independent labels were essentially the result of the decline of the major labels. They weren't like the specialty labels that existed side by side with them, at the same time. This was the next generation of really great classical music labels, and it's almost silly to call them independent as opposed to major because they became major. They were more major than the majors. But a bunch of things supported the existence of independent labels as we got into the 1980s and 1990s. The first thing was the advent of digital recording technology, which made actually making recordings much, much easier technically than had been the case previously. Essentially, you found a decent room, you set up your microphones, you turned on your tape recorder, and blammo. You had a digital tape, a digital recording. You could edit in your backyard, in your garage, on your helicopter, wherever you wanted to edit it. And you could just issue CDs all over the place. It was all very inexpensive, relatively speaking. So it allowed the barriers to entry fell away. The other thing that happened was easy international distribution, which allowed record labels to have an international reach, even though they were selling relatively small quantities. Most countries, and I was heavily involved with this in the 90s, particularly is when it all happened, had distribution in the United States, for example, from 4 or 5 major labels / distributors. And they had the entree into all the major record stores. The existence of chain stores like Tower Records and HMV and all these, and Barnes and Noble and all these, Best Buy, all these retailers that had classical music sections. It allowed for certain economies of scale, which permitted independent labels to do unusual and interesting repertoire, not have to sit on piles and piles of inventory, and distributed internationally relatively easily. And that all happened, at MIDEM and other conventions, trade shows, where people actually actively sought and formed contractual relationships with distributors. In the United States, the distributors were Qualitone for Hungariton and Eastern European stuff, Supraphon and the like, Allegro Imports, Albany Records, Harmonia Mundi, which was at once a label and an importer and a distributor. And all of these sort of making a little bit of money here and there, wherever you could, doing whatever you could, all of those helped tremendously in allowing the independent labels to get themselves on their feet. So, who were the major independent labels? The most important independent labels, the greatest ones, with huge catalogs. They have enormous catalogs of fabulous music. And some of it was taking advantage of repertoire niches, which the majors, for all that they did, and as you know from previous videos, they did a lot. But for all that they did, they hadn't done everything, not nearly. There was that. There was exploiting repertoire niches, and there was also the fact that the quality of second-tier orchestras and artists who weren't as famous as the major names was so good. There are just so many great artists out there who were worthy of being recorded. And they may not have had the most international careers, they may not have had the biggest names, but they deserve to be heard. And once they were heard, a lot of them jumped ship from the independent labels and went to the major labels. And it was almost always a mistake, almost always, because the major labels had no clue how to put together, a really interesting repertoire program that benefited these artists best. But they went anyway because the major labels still had the distribution. So, there was the economics were still there. Anyway, the greatest independent record labels, first Hyperion, founded by Ted Perry, an amazing, wonderful, top quality record label that focused on unusual repertoire of all types. Partly unusual British repertoire because they were in the UK and they had the artists, but also a fabulous roster of pianists and violinists and chamber ensembles. And they did extraordinary things. They had Leslie Howard doing the complete list piano music. They had the first complete Schubert song edition. See, this was a typical independent label project because seemed, when they started it, hopelessly ambitious. It was almost crazy. I mean, even Fischer Dieskau and Deutsche Grammophon, who did Lieder up the wazoo in huge boxes, didn't do all the Schubert Lieder. He couldn't, because some of them were written for female voice and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is, Hyperion was able to do it. They were able to do it because there were alternate funding sources, and because the basic price of doing a production was much, much less expensive if it only involved two people, a singer and a pianist, because there were wonderful singers who were willing to make records, not charge a fortune to do it. And the result was a landmark in the history of recordings. The Swedish label BIS, founded by Robert von Bahr, followed a very, very, very similar trajectory. Von Bahr was an edition completist. He started out early on doing the complete Grieg piano music, and then he did the complete Sibelius everything, then a huge pile of boxes, and then he did the complete Bach vocal music in Japan. It was a question of just finding the best artists wherever they were, having no preconceptions about how famous they were, but simply going by musical quality and using that to fill in all kinds of repertoire niches. In BIS's case, there was also tremendous quantity of Scandinavian music, Finnish music, Swedish music, Norwegian music. Composers like Gert Tveit, it was just marvelous. Jan Leifs in Iceland, a staggering vision when it came to the repertoire. And of course, a lot of these productions came already paid for. The label did not pay for many of these productions. That's true of all of the independents. The artists had to raise the money themselves. And they were often able to do it. They were able to do it because, they found patronage, the good old-fashioned way. You find a rich person and you suck all the money out of them that you possibly can. And you give it to your label to make your record and distribute it. And so as a result of that, the independent labels amassed tremendous catalogs and demonstrated, by the way, that there was still a ton of money in the classical music industry. There was no money for marketing and sales, and precious little for distribution, but there was an incredible amount of money for simply making records and finding a vehicle through which to issue them. And when the major labels were trimming down and shedding artists like crazy, the independent labels were there saying, hey, just go find some money and come to us. And the major labels nowadays do exactly the same thing. They don't pay for things. They accept prepaid for projects. And the funding comes from other forms of patronage, not from the corporate coffers of the label itself. And that model was pioneered by the indies and later co-opted by the majors, who still, of course, have a certain cachet to their name and distribution. So BIS is definitely a major independent. Next, Chandos, founded by the Cousins brothers, a wonderful label, focusing primarily on British music, with amazing cycles of all kinds of things. Bach's symphonies multiple times, Martinu symphonies multiple times. It's really kind of astonishing. Nielsen symphonies multiple times. And just a huge collection of unusual and lesser played repertoire focused on the fact that, did I say Martinu twice? They have Thompson doing Martinu. They don't have two Martinu cycles. That's wrong. Scratch that. They have a bunch of Nielsen cycles, and they had a couple of Vaughan Williams cycles, and they have a few things like that. But my point is, the first Edmund Rubra cycle, hey, there you go. And Malcolm Arnold, which was really cool. But the fact of the matter is that the second-tier British orchestras who they were working with are excellent. They can play anything, and they can do it well. And in partnership, as BIS and Hyperion were often, with the great national radio organizations and radio orchestras, which of course are taxpayer funded and paid for, and fundamentally, the result of that was the opportunity to record all kinds of repertoire that major labels wouldn't touch, and to build extremely large and distinguished catalogs based on that music. So Chandos was one of them. Perhaps the biggest of all was Harmonia Mundi. Harmonia Mundi began life as another sort of independent label, and really became a major international label. I mean, they had their own distribution, and they had their own roster of artists, some of whom are, among the biggest names in the business. I mean, they had Philippe Herrevega. They had, oh my goodness, I mean, who else have they got? I mean, back in the day, they had Nick McGagan. Harmonia Mundi also specialized in early music and music performed on period instruments. And as a result of that, they were able to put together an amazing roster of soloists. They got Andrew Mancy, got his start on Harmonia Mundi. Anonymous Four, singing, medieval chant and stuff like that, and equal-voiced polyphony, which was a revelation. There was so much repertoire that hadn't been heard before. The French Baroque repertoire, William Christie, really René Jacob. I mean, you just again, the list goes on and on and on of these absolutely fabulous artists who nowadays, in the classical music business anyway, are just about household words, and who were given the opportunity to amass enormous catalogs of distinguished work. And Harmonia Mundi had, at the same time, a wonderful repertoire vision and a quality image, very, very high quality image, that made them boutique labels. And people appreciated that. All of these labels, except the last, that we're going to talk about, had this image of being of higher quality than what the major labels were doing. And think about that. That is really an astonishing thing, because you're dealing with, I mean, the major labels had the name artists. And Deutsche Grammophon was not a shabby label. Decca was not a shabby label. None of these were. The American labels, they were pretty shabby in terms of their pressing sucked, and they had a much more mass market image. But the European labels, the way that they handled themselves, were always, a notch above, just basic pop music. But the independents were even a notch or two above that. They were really a boutique product, and buyers and listeners appreciated that. They liked being treated as, smart, high-end purchasers, even if the price of the disc was virtually the same as it was from anybody else. However, our last independent label was one of the most remarkable of all, and that's Naxos. And it's affiliated cluster now of labels, because Naxos has been doing the major label thing and sucking up smaller independent labels. Naxos owns Orfeo, it owns Capriccio, it owns Ondine, it owns a whole pile of other labels now. It took under its umbrella. And Naxos had a completely different business model that Klaus Heymann, who was the founder of Naxos, pioneered. Originally, he founded the label in order to promote recordings of his wife, Takako Nishizaki, who was out there making recordings of, what was it, the Yellow River Concerto, violin concerto, and selling billions of copies. She's a very fine violinist. And, what Mr. Heymann realized was that there were all of these Eastern European orchestras at the fall of the Iron Curtain in the early 90s and late 80s that would work for a pittance. You give them a flat fee, they'll do anything, they'll do it pretty well, and you own the recording forever. And you can issue it for $5, $6. Now, Naxos is practically a full-price label, or what used to be an upper mid-price label. But when it started, it was an extreme budget label whose philosophy was simply to record absolutely everything. And some of it would be great, some of it would be less great, some of it would sound great, because these were pre-packaged products. Largely, they had their engineers, but also they had, they would simply accept projects on a turnkey basis. And so some of them sounded great, some of them sounded less great, but they also had fantastic artists, because just like the situation with the other independent labels, the majors were shedding artists like crazy. And there were always more artists, young artists seeking outlets for their work, seeking to make recordings. And the only criterion they had was that the label that they worked with distribute their recordings. And Naxos set up very efficiently its own network of international distribution. And I remember very, very vividly, when Naxos got started, the issues they had with distribution and why they decided to do it themselves, because they were producing tremendous quantities of product, huge numbers of releases every single month, and flooding the market, basically. And they couldn't find a distributor who could pick up all of what they were issuing. I mean, the fact is, ClassicsToday.com originally, no longer, but at its founding was founded because Klaus Heymann asked me to start a independent review site. He said, which would be completely independent. He wasn't interested in any kind of editorial control. He just wanted his discs reviewed because he couldn't get attention for everything that he was putting out. And there was an attitude in the classical music industry that because it was a budget label, because it didn't look as snazzy as some of these other things, that it must be cheap and low grade and musically irrelevant. And when I had been writing for Fanfare back in the day, I didn't have any attitude about Naxos. All I cared about was what the thing sounded like. And if it was great, it was great. And if it wasn't, it wasn't. And if it was cheap, so much the better. And that's how Classics Today got started. Then I found other investors and I took it away from Naxos. The other irony I discovered when doing Classics Today is that we originally were doing tons and tons and tons and tons of new reviews all the time. And eventually we realized that it was better if we did less, because it was the classic value and scarcity argument. It made the things we did choose to review all the more important. And it allowed us at the time, and we're talking 25, 26 years ago, when we started in 1999, it allowed us to get support from the labels because the labels wanted reviews of their stuff. And so by being selective, we were able to get more support than we would if they took us for granted and just assumed we were going to review everything under the sun. It was a very interesting economic issue that we solved there. But anyway, the bottom line was that a few years later, we found other investors and ClassicsToday.com became totally independent. And now it only belongs to us at Classics Today, which is a good thing overall. But Naxos did an amazing thing. I mean, they became a major label, really the major label, the major force in the classical music industry over the course of the 90s and early 2000s. And that was an amazing accomplishment. They were an independent label, but they had a business model that was so successful and so smart, let's face it, that they were able to really very, very simply and quickly supplant in terms of the volume of business that they did, volume of titles sold and what they were doing, and quality, in terms of quality, a lot of what the major labels were doing. And that's where we are today with indies. Now, of course, we're in the next phase. Some of the indies, such as BIS and Hyperion, have been purchased by mega companies. We don't know what's going to happen with those catalogs. But I think, as you can see from these three chats, it's a cyclical process. It goes round and round and round. And new formats, new formulae, new economic models are continually being invented and tested, and rising and falling, succeeding and failing. And I see nothing changing anytime soon. So I hope you've enjoyed this little summary of the classical record labels and how they got where they got and did what they did. And I just want to end by saying once again, what an unbelievable quantity of stuff there is for us to enjoy. It's overwhelming. It's staggering. It's astonishing. And so you're going to have a lot of fun. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.